is Dmei Eitzim, which means the value of using it as firewood. Okay, so you have a Yisrael who went and ate this truma, so he has to pay Keren V'chomish. But since he's paying Keren V'chomish, it's his. He paid for it. Then he throws it up. Now, what's the value of food which was already consumed? Not so valuable. It's good for firewood. A second person decided to eat it, so how much money did he steal from the first guy? He stole the value of firewood, because it's not really food anymore. Okay, about 6 lines down, the 2 down. So the Mishnah told us that if a person eats and drinks, right, we learned there's a different shear, different amount to be chayev for eating and for drinking. And the Mishnah told us that if a person eats a little bit and drinks a little bit, it does not combine. Right? We learned yesterday that if a person would use liquids to enhance his food, right, for example, he would dip his challah into liquids, then that would be called achila. That would be called eating. The Mishnah is talking about if a person took a bite of challah and then took a sip of water, so the two shiurim are not mitzdarif, they don't combine together to be chayiv the kares. Says the Gemara, Man Tana, who's the opinion of our Mishnah? Amar Rav Chizda b'machlokas shnuya, Rav Yehudahi. Rav Chizda said, I think it should be dependent on the following machlokas, and it's the opinion of Rav Yeshua. Titanan, Klal Amar Rav Yeshua. Rav Yeshua said there's a rule. Kol shetum aso v'shi'uru shaveh, which means he's talking about in the halachas of tumah. And it means an item which the amount of time it makes the person tummy, and shi'uro shaveh, and the 2 items is the same amount, meaning, in other words, if you have 2 pieces of a dead person, a mace, okay, so a mace, if a person comes in contact, makes him tummy for 7 days. Okay, so there needs to be a kezayis of a mace, of a dead person, to make the person tummy. Now let's say you have 2 half of a zayises from 2 different mason, from 2 different dead people. So Rabbi Yeshua is saying, since each piece, each half of the zayis of the dead person would make a person tummy for the same amount of time, 7 days, vishi'uro shaveh, and each piece is part from a dead person, which the shear to make a person tummy is the same. It's a kazayas, so they share. It'll make the person tummy for the same amount of time, and to make a person tummy, they both need to add up to the same shear, which is a kazayas. In other words, you have 2 pieces from 2 different people, but they share both characteristics. Then mitzdarif. Then even though it's 2 half zayises, they can add together to make 1 big kazayas to make the person tummy for coming in contact with a kazayas of a mace. But if you have a case where tum aso velo shi'uro, which means the 2 items in front of you both make the person tummy for the same amount of time, but the 2 items are 2 different types of tumah, which have a different shear necessary to make the person tummy, or the opposite, shi'uro velo tum aso, then, or lo tumasav lo shi'ur, they don't share either characteristic, ein mitzdarfen. Then they do not combine together to make the person tummy. So Rabbi Yeshua's opinion was the only time it combines together, if you have less than the amount to add together to make the shear, to make a person tummy, is if they share both characteristics. Then both items need to be, they make the person tummy for the same amount of time, and it needs to be both items. The shear necessary to make the person tummy is the same by both items. Okay, that's Rabbi Yeshua's opinion. The Rabbanan disagree, and they're more lenient. They hold that even if you don't share all the characteristics, it still adds together. Okay, so back to our Mishnah. Our Mishnah said, if a person eats and drinks a little bit, it does not add together to make 1 big shear to be chayiv. So we asked, who's the opinion? Rav Chizda said, I think that's only true according to Rabbi Yeshua. And Rabbi Yeshua in Hilchas Tumah, who has a higher standard of when items of Tumah add together to make the shear, to make a person Tameh, I think that's the same thing that he'll hold by Yom Kippur. You don't combine the eating and the drinking. But according to the opinion that argues on Rabbi Yeshua, I think he would disagree with our Mishnah and say that a person eats a little bit and drinks a little bit, it does add together. Okay, so that's the first opinion. Rav Nachman says, no, our Mishnah, which is talking about adding together for Yom Kippur, I think that's true according to everybody. Because Ad kan lo kam Rabbanan Hasam elul inyan tuma the shame tuma chadhi. I'll tell you, the Rabbanan only argued by tuma because they held that all tuma is under one big umbrella, and therefore it's close enough to add together to make the person tummy. Aval hacha mishum yisuve daitahu. Like we learned yesterday, here the standard is yisuve daita, which is a certain level of satisfaction a person got from the food. V'hailu meisve daite. And if a person ate a tiny bite and drank a little sip, I don't think that hits the bar of yisuve daite, of a certain level of satisfaction. So again, our Mishnah said a person who eats a little bit, drinks a little bit, does not combine. Rav Chizda said, I think it's really dependent on a different machlokas of whether or not in Hilchas Tumah you hold it's easy for two items to add together or it's difficult for two items to add together. And Rav Nachman's arguing, no, I think our Mishnah should be true according to both opinions, because by Yom Kippur, since there's a different standard of Yisuve Daiti, a certain level of satisfaction, I think everybody would agree that eating a little bit and drinking a little bit would not combine. And we found this similar machlokas. Rish Lakish said, "B'machlokas shnui Rabbi Yeshua." Rish Lakish said our Mishnah is only true according to the opinion of Rabbi Yeshua. Ditnan klalam Rabbi Yeshua. Rabbi Yochanan said, no, I feel the same Rabbanan. I think our Mishnah is true even according to the Rabbanan. Ad kan lakam Rabbanan hasam elinin toma. You only see the Rabbanan over there were lenient in what makes a combination when it came to Tumah, because it's one big umbrella. But here, where the standard is Yisuve Daita, that certain level of satisfaction, so I don't think that this hits the standard of Yisuve Daita. Okay, says the Mishnah, Achal v'shasa behelam echad eino chayev al chatas achas. So the Mishnah is saying, the person who ate and drank by accident on Yom Kippur is only chayev one karban. So why is that? Because the source of not eating and not drinking on Yom Kippur is really the same pasuk, right? It's the pasuk asher lo se'una, person who didn't afflict himself on Yom Kippur. And as much as eating and drinking have a different shear, have a different standard, which we've been learning about, but it's really all, the source is the same source, right? We talked about it's the same source, and because the Torah didn't say achila, eating, that's how the Chazal understood that it doesn't mean a kizayis, the normal shear. Rather, the shear is dependent on yisuve daite, that certain level of satisfaction. And we learned about yesterday that by eating and drinking, there's differences. By drinking, it depends on the person. By eating, it's a standard shear, but it's all the same bottom line. The bottom line is what's called yisuve daite, right? So achila had its one assessment of what's called yisuve daite. Drinking had its own assessment. But ultimately, the source of both halachas, a person can't eat and drink, is the same pasuk. So that's why if a person ate and drank behelam echad, which means with one mistake, then he's only obligated in one karban because ultimately he only transgressed the one pasuk. But a person who ate and did malacha, broke Yom Kippur by doing malacha, then he's obligated in two karbanos because that's two different psukim in the Chumash. One says asher lo se'una, and another pasuk says kol malacha lo sasi. You can't do malacha on Yom Kippur. Achal ochlan she'ein ru'uyin la'achila. Bishasa mashkin she'ein ru'uyin l'shtiya. A person who ate foods which are not edible, which are not normal foods for a person to eat, or he drank drinks which are not a normal thing for a person to drink, pater, then he's exempt. That's not called he ate or drank. But shasa tzir umor yes pater. So tzir is liquids that comes out of a fish through salting. Morius is other liquids that just ooze out of a fish. Pater, those are two examples of foods which we would not call normal edible foods. Amarish Lakish mipnei malo nemra azhara be'inoi. So Rish Lakish seems to be bothered that the Torah never writes. I mean, this is going to be part of his answer. That there's no good way to write it, but the pasuk writes, if a person didn't afflict himself, then he's obligated in kares. So normally the Torah will say that it's prohibited for you to do malacha on Shabbos. And if a person does malacha on Shabbos, he's obligated to the following thing. In other words, first there's the warning, yazhara, then there's the punishment. A person's not allowed to eat this, and if you eat this, this is the punishment. By Inui, it skipped step one. The pasuk never said, I'm struggling how to phrase it, because you'll see from the way we're going to see the Gemara. The pasuk never gave the warning to the person. It just said, if a person didn't afflict himself, so then he's obligated the following. So Rish Lakish is bothered. Why did the Torah not say step one, the warning? Rish Lakish says the answer is mishum de lo efsher, because there's no good way to say it. Because why? Heichi nichtav. How should the Torah say it? Nichtav rachmana lo yochal. If you're going to say, the Torah should say don't eat. But achila b'kazayis. But the Torah didn't say don't eat, because the Torah wanted it to have a different shear than normal foods you can't eat, right? Which we learned about yesterday. Since the Torah wrote it differently, asher lo se'una, so therefore Chazal understood it's not the normal kizayis, it's a different shear. So the Torah, you can't ask, let it just say don't eat, because that's going to change halachas. The Torah, for whatever reason, wanted the standard in Yom Kippur to be different. Nichte rachmana lo se'una. So you'll say, let the Torah say lo se'una. Don't not afflict. But the Gemara is saying if it said those words, it would really sound like kum achol mashma. Lo se'una would mean don't afflict yourself. So okay, so don't afflict yourself. So go make a kiddush on Yom Kippur. So can't write that. Maskifler of Hoshia. In other words, what the Gemara is struggling with, what Rish Lakish is pointing out, is that if the Torah is telling a person, it's like a double negative. Don't not afflict yourself. To tell a person a negative command, which is demanding him to not do something, it's a very strange way to express it. Right? You can have a mitzvah to afflict yourself, which means don't eat and drink. But to have an ashara, which is a negative command, which is telling you to not eat and drink, it's a very hard way to express it. So Rish Lakish is saying, since there was no good way to express it, I think that's why the Torah didn't write it explicitly. Maskal of Rav Oshia, Nichter Rachmana Hishamer pen lo se'una. I have a way to say it. Say Hishamer, you should be careful, pen, I think the best translation would be like lest, lo se'una. Be careful that you don't come to not afflicting yourself. The Gemara says, why didn't it say that? Because we learned that there's a Gemara other places that says if the Torah says the word hishamer or pen, that's all a lo saseh, that's a negative command. So the Torah didn't want to say that because who says it wanted it to have more than one negative prohibition? The way you're suggesting to say it, it should come out with multiple lavs. Saying the Torah could have said it as, you should be careful b'mitzvahs inoi, in the mitzvah of inoi, and he's suggesting that if you would say that, we would understand it's really a lo saseh, a negative prohibition, because hishamer is normally a lav. B'mitzvahs inoi, you should be careful, which is a lav. B'mitzvahs inoi, in the mitzvah of afflicting yourself. Im kein hishamer de lav lav hishamer dasei aseh. We're saying that still wouldn't work, because if you say be careful about a mitzvahs inoi, which there's also a mitzvahs aseh to afflict oneself, so then you wouldn't have the right to learn that it's a lav, a negative prohibition, if there's already a mitzvahs aseh to afflict oneself. So then if you say hishamer, be careful about that, it doesn't turn it into a lav, a negative prohibition, it turns it into another mitzvah. Be careful about the mitzvahs haseh, the positive mitzvah of afflicting oneself. Okay, maskefler Ravashi nichtav al tasser mina inoi. Ravashi says it could have said al tasser min ha'inoi. Don't remove yourself from the affliction. So he found a way to phrase it with only one lav, one negative prohibition, and it's clear in the pasuk that it's not telling you to go eat, it's telling you to not eat. Don't remove yourself from the inoi, from the affliction. Where it says kasha? That's a good question. In other words, if you phrase it that way, so then Rish Lakish doesn't have can't say the Torah can't say the ashara, the warning, because there's no way. Because we found a way to phrase it, which all the halachas would stay the same, and still it would be clear what the Torah is trying to say. Okay, Vatana Maisi Lo Mehacha. And we have a Brisa who learned out the warning for afflicting oneself in Yom Kippur from the following source. It says, V'nisebs nafsho seichem, person should afflict oneself. So just to clarify, meaning when the Rambam and the Chinuch counted, they counted as two separate mitzvahs. There's one mitzvah saseh, positive mitzvah to afflict oneself. There's another mitzvah lo saseh, negative prohibition to not afflict oneself. Okay, so there's really two separate mitzvahs for the same actions. Okay, so the pasuk says, "V'nisevs nafsho seichem," a person should afflict oneself. The kol malacha lo sasu, and the person should not do malacha. Yachol yehi anush kares al tosefes malacha. I would think that maybe a person is punished for kares, for tosefes malacha. So tosefes malacha means that each day is defined by whatever is called nightfall until the next day. Tosefes malacha means that a person has to add on to the yontif. We'll see a little bit more of this on the next Amud. A person has to add on to the yontif a little bit before and a little bit after. So the Bryce is saying maybe a person should be chayiv kares. Right? If a person breaks Yom Kippur itself, so that's a punishment of kares. Right? Shabbos is kares. Yom Kippur is kares. Yontif is more lenient. It's just a lav, a negative prohibition. So the Bryce is saying maybe if a person broke Yom Kippur a little bit early, in other words, he started Yom Kippur early, which he's supposed to do. Okay, and then he broke Yom Kippur before it's officially nightfall. So I might think that a person who broke Yom Kippur, even though it's officially before the day of Yom Kippur, but if he broke it then, he should have the same punishment of kares. No, the pasuk says a person who does malacha on be'etzem hayom hazeh, which means on Yom Kippur itself, alitzumo shel yom, on Yom Kippur itself, anush kares. Ve'ino anush kares al tosefes malacha. Person's not punished for kares if he did it during the time, which is not the actual day of Yom Kippur, it's just the add-on to Yom Kippur. So the diak the Gemara is making is the be'etzem hayom hazeh. The words be'etzem hayom hazeh means on Yom Kippur itself, to the exclusion of the time before. Yachol lo ye'anash kares al tosefes malacha. Aval ye'anash kares al tosefes inoi. So the Bryce says maybe, but if a person ate or drank at that time right before Yom Kippur, maybe he's still punished for kares. In other words, we learned a person who did malacha, who broke Yom Kippur. But how do I know if a person ate or drank in that time before Yom Kippur, maybe he has the same punishment as doing it on Yom Kippur? No. Person who didn't afflict himself on be'etzem hayom hazeh, which means on Yom Kippur itself, then he's chayiv kares. Alitzumba shel yom anush kares, ve'no anush kares hal tosefes inui. But he's not obligated in kares if he did it at the time before. Okay, so we have a pasuk both by malacha, of not turning on lights, etc., that if a person does it in the time right before Yom Kippur, that's not the same stringency as doing it on Yom Kippur itself. And we have a pasuk by a person who ate or drank on the time before Yom Kippur is not the same stringency as Yom Kippur itself. Yachal lo yehi bechlal onish, aval yehi muzer, al tosefes malacha. I might think a person's not obligated in kares during that time, but he is obligated that he transgresses a negative prohibition, a lav. Tamalomer kol malacha lo sasu be'etzem hayom hazeh. So this is a pasuk when the Torah warns a person. Before we were talking about the psukim for the punishment psukim. If a person broke Yom Kippur, or if a person didn't afflict himself. Now we're talking about the pasuk about the warning. Pasuk by the warning says, Kol malacha lo sasu, person should not do malacha, be'etzem hayom hazeh, on Yom Kippur itself, alitzuma shel yom hu muzar, ve'eno muzar al tosefes malacha, that a person doesn't transgress the lav, the negative prohibition, on that time before Yom Kippur. Maybe a person transgresses a negative prohibition if he eats and drinks in that time right before Yom Kippur. No, Vidinhu, Gemara says you can learn that out from a Kal V'chomer. Ma malacha shenoheges b'Shabbos v'yomim tovim. That the prohibition of doing malacha, which applies much more often, it applies every Shabbos and Yontif, still eino muzar aleha. But I learned from this pasuk that in that time before Yom Kippur, a person's does not transgress that lav, that negative prohibition. So even though there's a stringency that the prohibition to do malacha is something which is very broad, and still the Torah limited it, it does not apply to that time before Yontif itself. So Shabbos v'yamim tovim. So this new mitzvah we found in Yom Kippur, that a person has to afflict himself, which is not very broad. It's a very limited case that we ever found it. Eino din shaliyeh muzar alav. Is it not a kal v'chomer that a person should not be more stringent than the prohibition of malacha, which is everywhere? So in other words, if the prohibition to do malacha, which is everywhere, still has a leniency that unless you're on the day itself, you didn't transgress the negative prohibition, so then this new mitzvah of inoi, afflicting oneself, shouldn't be more stringent. Okay, so we learned out 4 things so far. Okay, we learned on that time before Yom Kippur, both when it comes to the warning psukim. Psukim say you should not do malacha, you should not, you have to afflict oneself. So a person does not transgress a negative prohibition on that time right before Yom Kippur. It only starts and when Yom Kippur officially starts. And also the psukim by the punishments, by the kares, both by a person who does not afflict oneself and a person who does malacha, both of those also only start on Yom Kippur itself. Those are the 4 things we learned out so far. Says the Brisa, says the Brisa, but what's the source that there's a negative prohibition for a person to not afflict oneself on Yom Kippur? How do I know if a person eats and drinks on Yom Kippur that he transgressed a negative prohibition? Minayin, what's the source of that? So says the Brisa, Lo yomer onesh b'malacha de gomer mi'inoi. The source is like this. Why did the Torah write a punishment for doing malacha on Yom Kippur? You could have learned it from the pasuk about not afflicting oneself. That if by this new mitzvah of afflicting oneself, which is not something which is very broad, something we found only by Yom Kippur, still the Torah said a person's obligated in kares. So malacha sheneges b'Shabbos v'yamim tovim lo kol shekin. So malacha, the prohibition to do malacha, which is something which is a much broader obligation, we found it other places. So then for sure a person who did it on Yom Kippur should be obligated in kares. So lama nemar. So therefore, why did the Torah write another pasuk of kares by a person who did malacha on Yom Kippur? To tell you mufna, to make it extra, lahakish v'lodon mimenu gzeira shava, so that you can learn a gzeira shava connection between the prohibition to do malacha on Yom Kippur and the mitzvah to afflict oneself on Yom Kippur. Nemer onesh be'inoi v'nemer onesh b'malacha. That it said a punishment by affliction and it said a punishment by malacha. Ma malacha lo onesh alim kein hizir, just like by malacha, the prohibition to do malacha on Yom Kippur. That in the psukim itself, it says the warning pasuk and it says the punishment pasuk. So af inoi lo onesh alim kein hizir. So too we can learn out from that gzeira shava, that connection between the two, that when it comes to the mitzvah to afflict oneself, there's the pasuk that talks about the punishment, that's explicit. We're saying from this gzeira shava you can learn out that there's also a pasuk telling the person he's not allowed to not afflict oneself on Yom Kippur. So in other words, there's 4 things we're talking about. One is the warning pasuk and one is the punishment pasuk. That's 2. And we're talking about 2 different categories. Not doing malacha on Yom Kippur, so that's the warning and the punishment, that's 2. And the mitzvah of afflicting oneself, which is 3 and 4, the warning pasuk and the punishment. Okay, 3 out of the 4 psukim are explicit. 3 out of the 4 things are explicit in the parsha. The only thing that's missing is, where does it say that there's a negative prohibition for a person who eats and drinks on Yom Kippur? We know the punishment. We just don't know, where does it say a person is not allowed, that if a person eats and drinks, he transgresses a negative prohibition. So the Bryce is suggesting that the source of that is that you have a gzeira shava, connection between not doing malacha and the negative prohibition to not afflict oneself, and therefore you can learn them out. The gzeira shava was built on a question which was, let the Torah just write the punishment by not afflicting oneself, and I would know from a kal v'chomer that there's a punishment for not doing malacha. Gemara challenges that point. Ika lemifrach, I can ask a question at that point. You were saying just write the punishment by afflictions, and I would know if the Torah punished for kares by not afflicting oneself, then for sure it made a punishment for malacha. The Gemara is challenging, you would not have the right to learn that out, because inui has a stringency in it that we've never found. In the case where it was prohibited, we've never found leniencies in it, as opposed to malacha. There's a leniency in malacha. Rashi says that in the Beis HaMikdash, malacha is transgressed to do the avoda. And the Kohanim in the Beis HaMikdash, the Torah allowed them to, let's say, shecht, to bring karbanos, different malachas of Shabbos and Yom Kippur. So there's a leniency when it comes to malacha, so you would have no right to learn out from there. So the Gemara is going to try again. So I'll go the other way. Why did the Torah write both? By both psukim, the Torah wrote a punishment. By a person who ate and drank on Yom Kippur, and by a person who transgressed. Why did it write it by both? Just write it by malacha. Ma malacha shetra mechlala. If by malacha, which has a leniency, that I find places where it's allowed, for example, a kohen in the Beis HaMikdash, and still anush kares, still the Torah said a person's obligated in kares. So ino ishlahoter mechlala l'kol shekin. So when it comes to affliction, which I've never found that leniency, which means it's more stringent, is it not a kol shekin, all the more so that a person should be obligated in kares? So lama nemar. So why did the Torah write that second pasuk of kares by a person who ate and drank on Yom Kippur? Mufnet lahakesh v'lodin mimenu gzeira shava. To tell you to learn gzeira shava, connection between a person who ate and drank and a person who did malacha. Nemar onesh be'ino even nemar onesh be'malacha. It says a punishment by both. Ma malacha onesh ve'hizr. Just like by malacha, it's explicit in the psukim. You're not allowed to do malacha if you do kares. So af inoy onesh ve'hizr. So too by inoy, even though it wasn't explicit in the pasuk, a law of a negative prohibition for a person who eats and drinks, but from this gzeira shava we can really learn that out. Says the Gemara, that's also not good. Ika lemifrach malu malacha shkeino heges b'shabbasos v'yomim tovim tomer be'ino she'eno noeg b'shabbos v'yomim tovim. If it just wrote kares by Yontif and Shabbos, I would say you can't learn out there's kares for a person who ate and drank, because maybe it's just by Shabbos and Yontif, which is a much broader isser. We found it many other places, as opposed to Inoi, which we've only found one place. So what the Gemara is boiling down to is both malacha and the prohibition of eating and drinking on Yom Kippur each have a stringency about them, which makes it you can't learn one from the other. Shabbos and Yontif, the stringency is that we found it many other places. It's a much broader prohibition. And Inoi, the stringency it has is if we've never found leniencies built into it, as opposed to Shabbos and Yontif, in the Beis HaMikdash, there's leniencies for a Kohen to do things which typically are breaking Shabbos. Okay, so we're still holding by a question, which is, where do I see in the Chumash that there's a negative prohibition for eating and drinking on Yom Kippur? Okay, that's the one of the 4, right? The punishment by both was said, and the warning pasuk by malacha was said. We're just missing the warning pasuk about eating and drinking on Yom Kippur. So Ravina, Hai Tana etzem gomer. So Ravina said that he learned it from Gzeira Shava etzem. I mean the word etzem. Mufne. And there's something, and that those words are extra. Di lo mufne, if it wasn't extra, ika lemifrach kedibrachina. Because then you can ask what you were asking. In other words, the Gemara was trying to learn one from another with kal v'chomer, and the Gemara was saying, I can ask questions. But if it's an extra Gzeira Shava, so then Gzeira Shava works differently. In other words, kal v'chomer works that you see from the dinim, if this has a stringency and a leniency, so then you build off of it. The way kal v'chomer works is that if you have a pircha, which means if you can prove the flaw in the logic, so then you can't learn it out. Gzeira Shava, this is a machlokas in the Gemara about this, but Gzeira Shava generally works that that's more of a Masorah that a person has, that there's a connection between these two words. Okay, so he's saying if I have a Masorah that these two words are extra to connect the two, so then you can't ask any questions, because I have a Masorah from my Rebbe, ultimately from Har Sinai, that there's a connection between these two to learn them out. So la'ai mufna, so which case is it extra? No, sorry, la'ai afnu mufna. You're right that it's mufna, that it's extra. Michti chamisha kroi ksivi b'malach. I'll show you where it's extra. There's 5 different psukim said about not doing malacha. Rashi says there's 4 negative prohibitions about Yom Kippur, different places in the Chumash. And one place it says the punishment, the person's obligated in kares. So why do we need all 5 of those psukim? Chad la'azhar di yamama, chad la'azhar di leilya. One is to say at night you can't do malacha. One's to say the next day you can't do malacha. Chad la'onish di yamama. One's for the kares if he breaks Yom Kippur by day. Chad la'onish di leilya. One's if he breaks Yom Kippur at night. So we're covered. Now we have 2 warning psukim night and day. We have 2 punishment psukim night and day. And we still have a 5th pasuk. That 5th pasuk, which we couldn't figure out what to do with, the Gemara is saying the answer is that's really the source. In other words, that's to connect the prohibition of malacha to the prohibition of not eating and drinking. That's really the source. It's like imeno inyan. In other words, it's a connection to a different case to tell you that that's the negative prohibition the person cannot eat and drink on Yom Kippur. Okay. 3 lines from the bottom. So we had a different brisa that said it said inoi in 2 different places. So the other place, Rashi says, is where the pasuk says, and this is a person who had relations with a lady he was not supposed to. So there the pasuk says the word inoi, and in that parsha there's a punishment pasuk and a warning pasuk. So Rabbi Yishmael, the Tana, saying if another place in the Chumash where it said the word inoi, in that place there was an explicit prohibition and punishment, so therefore that would be enough to learn out to this case to say that's called the warning. So just to give one thing, that there's normally a rule that lo ana shelim ken hizir. That means the Torah wouldn't punish unless it gave a warning. So that's a rule. What I mean to say is we have a rule that says that if the Torah gave a punishment, then it must be somewhere in the Torah that there's a warning. Okay, so the Chinuch says an interesting thing, that why is it that there's such a rule? So that the person shouldn't think that the Torah said if you do this, you're punished for the following thing. The person could think that, okay, so I could take a risk. In other words, if I choose to go and eat this thing and get the punishment, so that's my decision. So no, the Torah said that if there's a punishment, that comes with it that there's rules. That's not a person's choice to decide to eat this and get the lashes. But the Torah is saying, no, I'm warning you that you're not allowed to eat it. It's not your decision. That's why there's such a rule. But what the Gemara is searching for, we know that there's a negative prohibition because of the rule, lo ana shelim ken hizir. So as much as we're finding things that don't sound like explicit psukim telling me that there's a lav, just giving a little context, that we're walking in knowing if the Torah wrote a pasuk that says you're obligated for kares, it must be somewhere there's a hint in the Torah that there's a prohibition. So what the Gemara is searching for is where's that hint? Meaning it's not coming from, if we find something, we can make it up. It's coming from a starting point is I know it's somewhere, because if the Torah said the punishment, there must be the warning, so the Gemara is looking for some hint. Okay, so he's saying if it said the word Inoi in a different place, and there it said explicitly the Azhara, that would be enough of a hint to say so too by the Inoi of Yom Kippur, the Torah said the punishment, it comes with it that there's a warning. Rav Acha bar Yaakov Amar Yolav Shabbos Shabbos and Mishabbos Bereishis, he says, I have a different source. Since the Torah referred to Yom Kippur as Shabbos Shabboson, so you can learn it from Shabbos Bereishis. Ma'ala halon la'ona shalom ken hizir, afkan la'ona shalom ken hizir. That just like by Shabbos, the Torah said explicitly the warning and the punishment, so too here, since the Torah referred to Yom Kippur as Shabbos Shabboson as a Shabbos, so therefore the same negative prohibition which was said to Shabbos would be enough to tell me by Yom Kippur. Rav Papa Amar, Hu gufei Shabbos ikri, dichsiv tishbetu Shabboschem. I'm sorry, the first one was saying that I can learn it from Shabbos. Just like by Shabbos, the Torah said a warning and a punishment, so too I can learn from there Yom Kippur. Rav Papa is saying, no, Hu gufei Shabbos ikri. That Yom Kippur itself is called a Shabbos. In other words, it's not that I need to learn it from Shabbos. It's like explicit in the pasuk itself by Yom Kippur. Techsiv tishbetu Shabboschem. Torah said you should refer to Yom Kippur as Shabboschem. So the first one was saying you can learn it from Shabbos, and the second opinion, which is Rav Papa, is saying you don't need to learn it. It's like the pasuk said it explicitly by itself. Bishmer Rav Papa lo amar ki Rav Acha bar Yaakov. I understand why this last opinion, Rav Papa, said what he said, because he had a way to explain that it's like explicit in the pasuk by Yom Kippur itself. It's not learning from somewhere else. So that's obviously the best. But the opinion right before, who said you can learn it from Shabbos, and he didn't say you can read it into the pasuk itself. So what was he running away from? Rav Papa, that last answer sounds like a nice answer. So why did he not want to say that and rather say you can learn it from Shabbos? He needed it for the following thing. That the pasuk says, person should afflict himself b'tisha b'chodesh, on the 9th of Tishri. So we all know Yom Kippur is not on the 9th. Yom Kippur is the 10th. The pasuk says a person should afflict himself on the 9th. Says the Gemara, Yochel Yaschol v'Yisana b'Tisha. Maybe a person should start fasting on the 9th. Fast 2 days? No, Talmud Lomer be'erev. The pasuk says the 9th at night, which means the end of the 9th, which is the 10th. I be'erev Yochel mishatechshach. If it just said be'erev at night, I would say that the fast should start at Techshach, Tzeitzah Kochavim, the night of Yom Kippur. No, Talmud Lomer b'Tisha, but the pasuk said on the 9th. So it seems to be a contradiction. Does it mean on the 9th you should fast, or does it mean you should start at the beginning of the 10th? So Haketzad Maschel Umesane Mibod Yom. So the Bryce is saying the answer is that a person should start his fast a little bit early. So this is the source, what we call Tosefes Yom Kippurim, adding on to Yom Kippur. That in one place the Torah said it starts on the 9th. That's only a source. For before Yom Kippur, a person should add on. How do you know after Yom Kippur a person should add on a little extra? Talmud Lomer mi erev ad erev, because the pasuk says from evening until evening. All I learned is that by Yom Kippur there's this mitzvah of adding on a little at the beginning, a little at the end. Yomim tovim or Shabbos minayin Talmud Lomer tishbetu. Because let's say Shabbos. How do you know by Shabbos there's the same mitzvah of Tosefes Shabbos, starting Shabbos a little early, ending it a little late? Because the pasuk said an extra word, tishbetu, which is a reference to Shabbos. Ein li ella Shabbos, yamim tovim minayin. How do you know even by every yontif there's this mitzvah called Tosefes yontif, adding on a little bit at the beginning and the end? Talmud Lomar Shabboschem. Because the next word is Shabboschem. So in other words, the Bryce is using the words tishbetu Shabboschem to learn out this mitzvah of Tosefes Shabbos, Tosefes Yontif, to add on a little bit at the beginning and the end. And this is the same words that Rav Papa used before. So the question was, Why did the opinion not learn out like Rav Papa? The answer is because he learned those words, Tishbetu Shabbaschem, for this brisa, which is saying a halacha about adding on a little bit to Shabbos, Yantiv, Yom Kippur. Ha-Ketzad. Kol makam shnemar Shavuos, any place where the Torah referred to it as Shavuos, to not do malacha, Mosif and Michal HaKodesh. There's a mitzvah to add on a little bit before, a little bit after. Okay, so there's a whole discussion in the poskim about how much it should be. In the summertime, when a person makes early Shabbos, it's obviously very easy. Just a thing a person should be careful with is that once a person accepts early Shabbos, then you can't have a mincha. Right? So a person shouldn't come into shul Erev Shabbos and say, I'm accepting Shabbos, and then you walk into mincha and realize you forgot to have a mincha, because then it gets very complicated. Okay, but the easiest way for a person to do this, you're at shul Erev Shabbos, a person's daven mincha, a person could just think or say for a second that I'm accepting Shabbos. And once you do this, then it's really Shabbos. That means you can't go out and make a phone call or something. But if a person just can go out for a second and say he's accepting Shabbos, so that's an easy way. It's an easy way to be makayim this halacha of Tosefes Shabbos. At the end of Shabbos, the simple understanding is that a person doesn't have to do anything. But once Shabbos is already in place, so then it happens naturally. And basically everybody basically naturally does it Motzei Shabbos, because whatever time you end Shabbos, it's basically built in that there's a few minutes for the Tosefes Shabbos at the end. Okay, V'tana de etzem, and the Tana we had on Amud Aleph, who had psukim coming to say that you're not obligated in kares if you eat and drink before Yom Kippur. You're not obligated in kares if you break Yom Kippur before. So he already saw in those psukim that there's a mitzvah of adding on to Yom Kippur. Because if a pasuk comes to say, you're not obligated in kares if you break Yom Kippur early, that means the Torah is working with an assumption that I should start Yom Kippur early. So I already see from that source that there's a mitzvah to add on to Yom Kippur. So Tana de etzem, who already saw it from those psukim, Hai b'tisha l'chodesh my avidle. So what does he do with this pasuk, which we just learned out as the source for adding on to Yom Kippur? He learned it for the following brisa. Tani chia barav midifti, v'nisem snafshe seichem b'tisha. Person should afflict himself b'tisha of chibetisha misanin, v'lo be'eser misanin. We know that Yom Kippur is on the 10th. So what does the pasuk mean on the 9th he should fast? That a person who eats and drinks on the 9th day, that he gets schar, he gets reward for as if he's fasting the 9th and the 10th. In other words, fasting is obviously much harder than eating. Right? I think Yom Kippur is probably harder than eating a yantiv meal. Okay, so it's going against the natural desires of a person to hold oneself back from food. So that gets bigger schar. So we're learning from the pasuk that a person who eats and drinks on the 9th day, he gets the reward like he's fasting on the 10th day. Just saw an interesting discussion that we know women are generally exempt from a mitzvah zasei man grama, from a mitzvah which is time-bound. If they choose to do it, they're welcome to do it, but they're not obligated to do it. So what's the definition of this mitzvah, eating on the 9th day? Are women obligated in this mitzvah? In other words, it's technically time-bound, because it's the 9th day of Tishrei, you have to eat. But at the same time, the way the Torah is hinting it to us is saying you should fast on the 9th day, which we're interpreting to mean you should eat, and it's as if you get schar for the fasting. So on the fasting, they're obligated, and the Torah told us this mitzvah in a way of referring to it as if it's fasting. So do we say it's the normal rule and therefore they're exempt? Or do we say that they're really obligated since the Torah hinted it to us in a way that it's referring to it as if it's fasting? Okay, we'll stop here. It's Hashem tomorrow. There's a shorter daf, so we'll make up.